One. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Will Work for Podcast. We have Erin Cech. That's correct. Did I say that right? Cech. Sorry.
That's all right.
We have Erin Cech on the program. She's an associate professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan who studies cultural mechanisms of inequity reproduction, including gender, race, and LGBTQ bias in STEM and other professions. She's also authored the book, The Trouble with Passion. Welcome to the show, Erin.
Thanks for having me.
I think I just read off a bunch of credentials there, and I was just really hoping that we could go through your career just for the beginning and start to get more of a sense of your, how you all came here to be this.
Yeah, absolutely. So my career is a little bit of an odd transition, both just in general, but also because of what I study. So I started off my educational career in electrical engineering. So I have an electrical engineering undergraduate degree and was on track to go into that field. I was really interested and invested in things around assistive technologies. My grandmother was blind, so it was something that was really important to me. But as I went through my engineering education, I realized that I had a lot of broader interests that were beyond just the aspects of engineering that were about dealing with electrons on a day-to-day basis. I was interested in how people were engaging with technologies, and et cetera. So I tacked on a sociology undergraduate degree to my engineering degree and decided that I really wanted to study issues of inequality within STEM. And so I sat down with my parents and I told my parents, I want to follow my passion. I want to leave engineering and I want to follow my passion into sociology. And I was an evangelist of the idea of following your passion really until I came to studying the research that I did for the book.
Great. Well, let's just get into it too, because that's why we me and Brennan both read Loving Your Job as a Capitalist Trap. And which article you had, I believe, in the Washington?
In the Atlantic.
The Atlantic, thank you. Sorry. And it was really fascinating because the article's topic really revolves around the idea of this, like you just said, following your passion can kind of be a huge pitfall for people when they're pursuing careers. And yeah, I'd love to just get into this, how you found this research, why you wrote the article, all of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, this idea that we should follow our passion seems like an obvious goal, right? For many people, particularly in the United States. Obviously, that should be a career goal. If you can do it, follow your passion, do what you love. And I started out the research that ended up being this book by trying to understand how young adults come to make career decisions. So they, especially those who are in college, are facing really a buffet of different options to them. How do they decide? What are the things that they prioritize? And if you look at the literature in social science, a lot of it says people are prioritizing job security and salary as the driving factors in their career decisions, even for those young adults in college. And that just didn't resonate with what not only I was hearing from my students, but also with what the students were saying to me. And so I did interviews with students at 100 college students across 3 universities in the US. And I kept hearing this narrative of passion seeking over and over again. It was almost like I had handed them a script to read back to me. And in terms of, prioritize your passion, think about job security and salary later to the extent that you can. And as a sociologist, I've been really interested in a long time to understand how these taken for granted cultural narratives that seem on their surface to be really positive or at least neutral can have hidden within them really problematic assumptions or even mechanisms in ways that can reproduce inequality. So I decided to turn my gaze onto something that I had personally followed, right? I had personally sought my own passion and thought to explore what are some of the issues that are embedded within this idea of following your passion.
Yeah. And this is really interesting because I talked about this with my partner, after I read your article, because, this is what the stuff of movies and dreams are made of, right? Everybody, everybody makes the movie about the person who sold their house and then moved to like the Greek islands and like started a bar or something like that. And so we hear all the success stories, but I like to affirm it more to like the lottery. Like a lot of lottery winners go broke and like they're because they get overwhelmed by this like information or whatever, and then it all goes awry because like you think you get what you want, but it might go south. So yeah, let's like talk a little bit more about this. Like, what did you find? Like,
Yeah.
was it
So, I mean, one of the things I found is why. So I'll talk about the kind of pitfalls that I found in a second, but I think it's really useful to think about why this is such a popular way of thinking about career decision making at all. And what I find is that it's so popular. It's such a powerful way to think about career decision making because people who are making career decisions recognize that to be successful isn't just investing 40 hours a week in a predictable schedule that you then can go home and spend time with your family and friends and do the thing that you like, right?
right?
We know that to do work, you are investing 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week in this line of work. And so the thought process is for many people, if I'm going to be spending that kind of time, I don't want it to be something that feels like drudgery. And so it's a response to the demand for overwork, the expectation for overwork, as well as the lack of stability that we have in many professions, right? We can't, like our grandparents and great grandparents, can rely on our organizations to kind of take care of us and keep our jobs as long as we're doing it good enough. So we have this kind of work scenario where we're working a lot of hours and we can't be guaranteed a job long term. So for many people, the solution to that is, well, I'm going to do something that I love. There's a number of problems with that, however. You alluded to one of them, and that is not everybody has the same resources to be able to take what they're passionate about and turn it into something that can sustain them financially or has some kind of job stability. What I find in the research, especially with those who have a college degree, is that those who come from wealthy families or upper middle class families have what I call safety nets and springboards. Like their parents will help them pay their rent as they take an unpaid internship, or their parents have friends in a particular line of work that they connect their kids to, and they are much more successful at launching into work that they're passionate about and has some kind of sustainable income or some kind of sort of long-term job stability. And so that's one of the pitfalls is we advise passion seeking for everybody, but passion seeking for some can mean a much more treacherous embarkment on their career trajectory than others.
Right. Because you could go sell stones, you know, to go to like different places in the US if you have like the support system to make sure that if something does happen to you, somebody will support you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is ridiculous. Like we see these trends all the time is like when you talk about, you already said it, like unpaid internships, people are like, oh, you can just do this. Like, okay, well, like, no, because a lot of people have to support their family and like that's not like a realistic goal. And even when they are paid, it's like so undervalued. It's like, I can't do this with like in any reality. So
exactly.
Yeah, I just like have so many. So what is this? Why? Like, why? How can we break this cycle then? Or like, what is? Because I don't want to tell people, okay, well, like, don't follow your passion because like, it's the double-edged sword, right? Because there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for some people, but not for everyone. So I guess how do you mitigate that?
Yes, so that is the difficult question here because it is, and the reason I think it's sort of an interesting thing to study at all because it is this thing that seems really great on the surface for the people who can make it happen, and so to critique can seem a little bit weird, but for people who have the resources and are able to follow their passion, that doesn't necessarily seem like a risky solution to the issue of facing sort of expectations of overwork and sort of instability of employment. But even for those people who have those sort of resources, those safety nets and springboards, it is even risky for them. And it's risky for a number of reasons, essentially being that it can be really existentially risky. And by that, I mean, if you invest a deep core part of your identity in your career trajectory and the job that you're doing, and you then go and seek work in that, you are putting your sense of identity in the hands of the capitalist post-industrial economy, right? Which is
Right.
inherently unstable, right? We know there's all these sort of winds of change, and we've seen that in the context of the pandemic. And so you might lose your job, then that might not only be losing a way to sort of pay your bills on a day-to-day basis, but a sense of your identity, a sense like a core understanding of yourself. And that can feel incredibly detrimental for people. And so those folks who are in that position where they either want to pursue their passion or they have, and they're in work that they're passionate about, I think there's a couple of ways to mitigate this kind of existential risk. One is to really evaluate the footprint of your job in your day-to-day life. So for many professionals, there is this all-encompassing access that their employer has to them, right? Their Slack channels are always on, their cell phones are always on, they're always checking their email. And that opens up so many more hours of your day to kind of being pinged by your employer than if you were able to set a little bit more boundaries. And so one of the suggestions is to try and shrink the footprint of work in your life to allow you time to do things outside of your paid employment. And one of the things I recommend in the book is doing something that I call diversifying your meaning-making portfolio. And by that, I mean really thinking about what gives you meaning and fulfillment completely separate from your paid employment. That could be your family time, but that could also be hobbies and sports or other activities. How can you make room in your schedule for investments in that so that you can anchor your sense of identity in something that's wholly separate from your participation in the paid workforce? And that's not easy for working professionals in particular who are working 80 hours a week to find 2 hours a week to do that takes work. It's hard, but I would argue that it's incredibly important, not only for a sense of work-life balance, but also for a sense of sort of more existential stability. And just a quick note on the importance of that, not only to kind of broadening our platform of meaning making. There's research that shows that when we have more time for rest, when we have time for creative endeavors that are separate from our work, we are more effective and more productive at our work hour by hour than if we don't have those opportunities for rest and rejuvenation.
Yeah, I thought when you correlated what you put into your job, because I've worked in the the nonprofit sector. I work in international development right now, and a lot of it goes around idealism of helping and being just intrinsically wanting to give back to the community. And so your correlation of that, when I talked to a rabbi with this, ironically, and he was saying if your job helps people, you should just take that. It doesn't have to be the job itself doesn't have to define you, but your output can define you as just being a good person. And I really enjoyed that piece of the article where you're you put way too much more. People do. I see this all the time. People put, especially when you're young, you put way too much on your job. You're I'm gonna come in here. I'm gonna make this this job is gonna redefine who I am and make me the person that I want to be. And it's dude, a lot of jobs are just paperwork and stuff that you just do on a regular basis. Do you have good outputs? Sometimes, but you need to separate that. How should we be teaching this in schools? I don't know how. I always get a little frustrated with this because we never teach people how to navigate this, especially at an early career on early career stages. So,
yeah, especially in the United States. I mean,
right.
just take the question of what do you want to be when you grow up as an example. That it's just bonkers to me that in the United States, but in many other sort of Anglophone countries as well, we ask young kids that, like from the time that they're 3 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? And we expect the answer to be an occupation,
Right.
not a sentiment, not a sense of I want to be this kind of person, or I want to contribute this to the world, or I want to be a good friend or a parent or community member, or contributor to whatever. And that is, I think, there's no clearer example of how we tie people's identity to their occupation than a question like that. We read off of somebody's job so much about who they are that is part of the reason why young adults feel so much pressure to figure out what it is they want to do and figure out what their passion is. Because if they don't know what their passion is, it often feels to them like they don't know what a part of their identity is, right? So they're kind of looking for that, and that's really problematic. But I absolutely agree with that advice from the rabbi in that there's such a focus on finding passion for the substantive aspect of the work, the kind of content of the work. But job satisfaction comes from many different parts of our work, like how we feel when we go home on a day-to-day basis. It's not just the things that we're doing, the content, but who we're working for, who we're working with, what our relationships are with our colleagues and our clients, where we are working, and what our organization is doing more broadly. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can think about changing our work for the better that isn't just about quitting and pursuing something that's more aligned with our passion substantively. Sometimes it can mean finding an organization in the line of work we're already in that has better alignment with kind of colleagues that we enjoy working with on a day-to-day basis, for example.
Yeah. I'm starting to like recognize it, like, how they say toxic masculinity. I kind of recognize it as like toxic positivity, like everybody getting on TikTok and be like, you should all live in a van. I was like, I don't want to live in a van. Like, why would I want to do that? And so I think that's a lot of the stuff I see, especially in the workforce. They're like, oh, you have to be positive about your job. You have to like your job. I was like, there are plenty of people who like don't like their jobs, but like they like the life that it affords them. So, and
Right.
that's okay. So like, yeah.
And I think a problem with that as well is when it comes to this playing out within particular organizations, where if you're working in a place, I think, the sort of Googles and Facebooks are sort of particularly, this is pernicious, particularly there, where there's a sense that everyone is there and is really passionate about doing the work. They're really committed. They're really invested. And what that means is that if people are critical of what is going on in the organization or what they're doing in their work on a day-to-day basis, that is seen as an affront to the work itself. And for many people will question their expertise or their ability if they're not performing passion at the right level in the right way. And it also means that if everyone in a particular work group or a work environment is expected to do work as though they are passionate about it, there's very little space for critical critique or conversation about how to make the work environment better. And so there may be somebody who is really struggling for a variety of reasons, but doesn't have any space to articulate those criticisms or go to the management to say, I'm having this issue with my job, because there's no social space for that level of critique when everybody is expected to be passionate about the work that they're doing.
Interesting. So basically the organization is basically saying we are like this great organization that does this great work, so you should just be an awesome person at all times.
Right. Yeah. You should be glad. It is a privilege to work for us. Yes.
Yeah, I see that, especially in the nonprofit space a lot, because it's all about like the mission and not like the person. And I'm like, these people, not getting paid a lot to like for this mission. So, but that's really interesting. I'm interested in your research. Does this affect people of color like on a bigger basis? Like, because a part of the student debt crisis is like people going to college and then not getting a degree, like going for a semester, not being able to afford it, and that's what. And that happened. Has that ever like facilitated into this like passion? Is like, oh, I got this certification to do this job, but like I really didn't need this certification, and now I'm like in a job I didn't understand, and now I don't like it, and like it's all kind of spirals. So I was interested in your perspective, what you found.
Yeah, so it tracks sort of along and reproduces racial ethnic inequality in a couple of ways. One is that there are obviously socioeconomic socioeconomic differences that track along with racial ethnic differences in the U.S. because
Right.
of some historical patterns of oppression. And so students of color are more likely to come from working class, first generation families, and they are then more likely to not have access to the kinds of safety nets and springboards that the white upper middle class wealthy students are more likely to have access to. And so that is a racialized way in which economic inequality is reproduced, and so gets reproduced more intensely for workers of color in particular who are trying to pursue their passion compared to particularly white middle class, upper middle class career seekers and professionals. But there's another way in which it is, I think, reproduces patterns of racial inequality in the US, and it's a little bit more abstract. And that is, what I find is that people who adhere to the passion principle, who sort of are aligned with this idea, are also more likely to look at things like gender segregation and race segregation in occupations and explain that away as people just following their passion. Meaning that there are systemic differences in sort of what groups are in what occupations. So doctors and lawyers are more likely to be white men than teachers or nurses assistants, things like that. So that's sort of gender and race occupational segregation. And people who adhere to the passion principle say, well, that people should just follow their passion. And the reason that we have those is women and people of color just have different passions. And so that's why we have these patterns. And so we don't need any structural change, right? This is sort of how it is. And it's something that I call choice washing. It choice washes these sort of endemic, systemic patterns of inequality in a way that doesn't provide any backing for making any kind of sort of institutional or cultural change.
So you explain away segregation by saying segregation. It just is
that people want segregation.
They already want it intrinsically, so it's fine.
Yes.
That's a very Jordan Peterson explanation I've heard. But so that's because that's what I fear. Like when I read about this passion principle from you, I always thought like that's what happens with like predatory loaning, because like when you do the for-profit schools, because they're like, come be a doctor, come be an engineer here, follow your passion, and like we'll do whatever it takes to like get you through this program. But like people don't understand what that means. Like they have this dream and it leads them to ruin. So like that just
exactly.
I really worry about all that sometimes.
Yeah, and the infrastructure so in the last 30 years, there's been this huge expansion in the different kinds of majors that colleges offer. So there's like sports broadcasting or hospitality or things like that. And many of these majors are actually things that are a little bit more kind of like vocation leaning or even entertainment leaning, and often are majors that are directed to low-income first-gen students, which are more likely to be students of color than white students. And so you have students that are pursuing those majors, and they're often at universities that don't have the support for financial aid and student loans. And so students are taking on tremendous amounts of student loan debt, don't have the same kinds of safety nets and springboards to get a job in sports broadcasting, for example, and just are carrying around tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loan debt. And the university is saying, it was your choice to pursue this major, right? Yeah, it was your passion. You chose it. Yeah.
it was your passion, so now like this is all on you. And I was like, well, I paid you for something. But I man, so what advice would you give like job seekers like when they are trying early careers? I we kind of talked more about like early career job seekers, but also people who are like career switching and they're like, I just want to do something different because I hate this job. And it's like, I need to go do something different, and then they end up doing something crazy because of that. So like, how do you what advice would you give to get around the passion principle and like to have a more focused view of like what your life should be in the career?
Yes. So first and foremost, step back and ask yourself, what do you want your relationship to paid work to be? Paid work meaning the role of paid employment in your life on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, year-to-year basis. Are you okay with, invested in working those long hours? Or do you want a job where you can contain your work to a set time and a set schedule to be able to invest in other things? What kinds of trade-offs do you need to make in terms of the content of the work that you're doing, or any kind of additional training you might need to be able to get that? So more sort of globally and holistically, how do you want work to play out with your other life goals? I think stepping back and asking that question is really important, and it allows you to kind of pull back away from the demand that we find sort of substantive commitment in the work that we do. I think for people who are at a place to say, look, I hate my job and I have this other side gig, I want to see if I can make that happen and turn it into my career, follow my passion and do that. I think if you have the resources and you have the financial backing and enough cash in your savings account to be able to do that, that's one thing. If you don't have those kinds of resources, that is unfortunately a much more difficult consideration. And at that point, I think it becomes really trying to identify, what is it about your job that you hate? Is it your job or is it your career path? Right? If it's the content of the work, that might lead to a seeking of a different kind of content. But if you really analyze it and say, it's these 3 people that I work with that really make my life miserable, and it's not the content of the work, it's the people or my colleagues or, the company I'm working with. How can I change companies within the same line of occupation that will allow me to get relief from the things that are really troubling me? And I think more broadly than that, I think we have to think more collectively about what we do with these issues. So part of the reason why passion seeking seems like such a good idea is because there are these tremendous problems of the current post-industrial labor force. And ultimately, we're not going to improve those processes unless we make collective actions, meaning that we not only improve the work quality and the work experience for people who have the resources to push back and fight with their manager about whether they get flex time or not, but really being able to do that much more broadly. So fighting for the work quality and the work experiences of people who labor in jobs that have far less ability to feel like any kind of passion toward them, right? So thinking about, as a whole, how can we push back on those demands for overwork more broadly?
That's some great sound advice. Throwing some truth bombs down here, and it's great. I love it. So if people want to hear more from you and like get more information, where can they find you?
Great. The book is called The Trouble with Passion: How the Search for Fulfilling Work Fosters Inequality. It's available on all the standard online booksellers, of course. My website is erinacech.com, ERINACECH. And I'm on Twitter at SechErin.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been so great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.